I remember the first time I heard her name, Hope. It was early 2019, and I had just started volunteering at the Bornean Sun Bear Conservation Center, BSBCC, in Sepalik, Sandakan, a sanctuary nestled in the lush rainforests of Sabah, Malaysian Borneo. The center is one of only a few in the world dedicated to the smallest and one of the rarest bear species on Earth, the sun bear. These little bears are known for the golden, crescent-shaped patch on their chests and their disproportionately long tongues, evolved perfectly to slurp honey from beehives and termites from rotting logs. Despite their charm and critical ecological role, they are under constant threat from deforestation, hunting, and the cruel trade of wildlife trafficking. It was during my third week that I heard about a new bear coming in. The keepers were quiet, focused. There was no excitement, only a subdued urgency. That was when one of the senior staff told me about her, Hope. Hope's story didn't start at the center. It started in a cramped cage at the back of a private residence in central Sabah. She had been kept illegally, without a permit, and hidden from authorities. The owners had acquired her as a cub. Whether they found her after her mother had been killed by poachers or they took her straight from the wild, no one could say for sure. What we did know was this: she had spent most of her early life in a cage barely larger than a small dog kennel, fed scraps of rice and fruit, deprived of sunlight, space, and the essential social learning a cub would receive from her mother. She had no name when the wildlife department first saw her. She was discovered during a raid conducted by the Sabah Wildlife Department with support from NGO partners and local informants. Someone had tipped them off, an anonymous call from someone who knew the bear was there but was afraid to speak up publicly. That tip saved her life. I wasn't there during the confiscation, but I've heard the story from the rescue team countless times. They arrived early in the morning, around 6 a.m. The owners weren't hostile, just shocked. They insisted they had only kept the bear as a pet, and had no intention of selling or harming it. But it was clear to the officers that the situation was illegal, and urgent. Hope was found in a rusted cage tucked under a zinc roof behind the house. The cage was surrounded by garbage, old motorcycle parts, and buckets of stagnant water. She was crouched in the far corner, visibly shaking. Malnourished and dirty, her fur was dull, and patches of skin were exposed from excessive scratching and stress. Her claws were overgrown. Her eyes, they said her eyes told the full story. Wide and unsure, they darted from face to face, not trusting any movement, even when they opened the cage. She didn't lash out or growl. She didn't even resist. She simply curled into a ball, head tucked under her paws. That's when they knew they were dealing with more than physical trauma. Transporting her to BSBCC wasn't easy. She had to be sedated gently and secured in a transport crate for the 6-hour journey. When she arrived at the center, we were all asked to give her space. Only the veterinary team and most experienced keepers were allowed near her during those first critical days. She was placed in quarantine, as required for all rescues, where she would be monitored for diseases and parasites and slowly introduced to a better diet and care routine. I saw her for the first time through the small observation window in the quarantine area. She looked like a shadow, small, hunched, barely moving. She wouldn't make eye contact. She didn't touch the food left for her until long after the room was cleared. But despite everything, she was alive. And that, in itself, was a miracle. It was one of the senior keepers, Gloria, who gave her the name, Hope. I asked her why, and she said, because that's all she had left when we found her. And now, she has a future. Hope's rehabilitation was going to be long and uncertain. Sun bears are notoriously difficult to rehabilitate after captivity, especially if they've spent their formative months isolated from other bears. They often develop stereotypic behaviors, repetitive movements like pacing, head bobbing, or swaying, that are signs of deep psychological stress. Hope displayed all of them. But the staff didn't give up. The process was slow. Every day, a keeper would sit quietly outside her quarantine room, speaking softly, sometimes reading aloud or playing recordings of the forest. The goal was simple: let her know she was safe. Little by little, she began to emerge. Her diet was adjusted, no more scraps, but a balanced mixture of fruits, vegetables, eggs, and a specially formulated bear porridge. She was given enrichment tools, logs filled with honey, puzzle feeders, and leaves she could tear apart. Slowly, she started exploring her environment. She began to respond to the sound of her name, sometimes peeking out when called. After nearly 2 months, she was cleared from quarantine and moved to a larger enclosure. That's when I started working more closely around her area. One of my jobs was preparing enrichment and monitoring bear behavior. I remember the first time I saw her explore her new space. She sniffed every corner, carefully but curiously. She climbed for the first time, awkwardly, with trembling limbs, but it was a start. And she found a shady spot near a tree trunk and lay there for hours, seemingly just being. That was when I realized she was finally learning how to be a bear again. I once caught her playing with a pile of dried leaves, tossing them in the air and pawing at them like a cub. It broke my heart and filled it all at once. This creature, once so traumatized, was rediscovering the instincts that had been buried under fear and neglect. That small, joyful moment was the result of months of care, patience, and understanding. At BSBCC, bears are never forced into interactions. Everything is about choice. When to eat, where to go, what to explore. Hope had never had choices before. Now, every day was a new chance to exercise them. Over time, we noticed she had a particular fondness for banana leaves and coconut husks. She'd drag them to a corner and build herself a little bed. She began engaging with her enrichment tools, licking honey from logs and climbing more confidently. Eventually, she even began vocalizing, soft grunts of curiosity, occasional huffs when startled, and sometimes, a low, woof, that meant she was playful or alert. But perhaps the biggest milestone was when she was introduced to other bears. By the time Hope was ready to meet other bears, it had been almost 7 months since her rescue. Her physical condition had greatly improved, her coat was glossy, her weight had stabilized, and she was visibly stronger. But the emotional scars were slower to heal. At BSBCC, introducing a rescued bear to others is never taken lightly. It requires weeks, sometimes months, of observation, planning, and controlled introductions. Not all bears can coexist. Each one arrives with a different history, temperament, and degree of trauma. For Hope, the process began with something we call fence line introductions. In simple terms, 2 bears are placed in adjacent enclosures with a shared fence, allowing them to see, smell, and observe each other without physical contact. Hope was placed next to another rescued female bear named Dodop, a slightly older bear who had been at the center for over a year. Dodop had come from a similar background but had adjusted well to her new life. She was curious and calm, with a nurturing personality that made her ideal for helping newly rescued bears. The first meeting was tense. Hope approached the fence cautiously. She sniffed, backed away, then sat down at a distance. Dodop, on the other hand, came right up to the fence and huffed gently, a sign of interest but not aggression. For several days, they simply coexisted on either side of the barrier. No growling, no signs of stress, just observation. Then, one day, something incredible happened. Hope pressed her nose to the fence. It was a small gesture, but one that brought the entire staff to a standstill. Dodop responded by doing the same. From that moment on, the two were often seen lying close to each other, separated only by the mesh. Hope, who had spent her early life in isolation, was making her first social connection. After several weeks of positive interaction, the decision was made to attempt a physical introduction. It would take place in one of the larger forest enclosures, a semi-wild environment with trees, climbing structures, and natural terrain. It's not the full jungle, but it's as close as most of our bears can get. I remember the morning vividly. The team had everything prepared, multiple staff on standby, tranquilizers ready in case of emergency, though rarely used, and video monitors in place. The gates were opened slowly, and the 2 bears entered the shared space. Dodop was the first to move in, sniffing the air and walking with confidence. Hope followed cautiously, pausing every few steps. The moment they saw each other, they both froze. Then, in an instant, they ran, straight toward each other. There was a collective breath held across the control room. Were they fighting? Were they playing? They were hugging. I'm not exaggerating. Bears don't hug like humans do, of course. But they stood up on their hind legs, gently grabbed each other's shoulders and touched noses. There was no aggression, no fear. Just a strange, beautiful recognition. From that day forward, Hope and Dodop were nearly inseparable. It wasn't always smooth. Hope had no experience with dominance behavior or social play, and at times she'd withdraw if Dodop became too assertive. But over time, their relationship found its rhythm. They foraged together, shared enrichment items, and often napped in the same shady spot under a fallen tree. This progress opened new possibilities for Hope. Socialization is essential for rescued bears. In the wild, sun bears are solitary, but in captivity, especially for those raised without natural maternal guidance, interaction with other bears can be vital for psychological recovery. It teaches them confidence, communication, and play, things that seem instinctive, but are often lost when bears are taken from the wild too young. By early 2020, Hope had been integrated into a small group of female bears, each with her own story of rescue and recovery. Among them were Bermuda, rescued from a resort that had kept her as a tourist attraction, and Kinna, named after the Kinnabatangan River, where she was found orphaned. Together, these bears formed a sort of makeshift family, a sisterhood born not of blood, but of shared survival. During this time, I began to notice something new in Hope: curiosity. She started climbing more, exploring higher branches, and investigating every new item we introduced into the enclosure. Once terrified of loud noises, she now reacted with interest rather than fear. She had even developed a sort of swagger, walking with a confident stride and occasionally asserting herself during feeding times. She was becoming a true sun bear. But even with all this progress, the center knew one thing for certain: Hope could never return to the wild. Unlike some of our rescued bears, who had spent minimal time in captivity and retained strong survival instincts, Hope's early trauma and long period of confinement meant she would not survive on her own in the forest. She lacked the necessary fear of humans and the skills needed to forage, find shelter, and navigate territorial threats. It's a heartbreaking reality, but also one we accept with humility. Not every rescue leads to release. Sometimes, the victory lies in giving a bear like Hope the next best thing: a life filled with choice, enrichment, and dignity. In early 2021, something remarkable happened. A delegation from the Sabah Wildlife Department visited the center. They were conducting a broader campaign to highlight the impact of illegal wildlife trade and wanted to include a story that would resonate with the public. When they met Hope, they found their symbol. Photos of her hugging Dodop, licking honey from enrichment logs, and climbing trees made their way into national media. Her story was shared in school programs, conservation events, and even international conferences. She became the face of what illegal trafficking does, and what rescue and rehabilitation can undo. That year, the BSBCC hosted its annual Wildlife Awareness Month with Hope as the featured ambassador. Posters, banners, and educational materials carried her story under a simple yet powerful message: Hope is stronger than fear. Schoolchildren from across Sabah visited the center and heard her story. Many wrote letters to her, some even drawing pictures of bears in trees with the word Hope in bright colors. One letter, written by a 10-year-old girl, read, "Thank you for being strong. I will help you by telling my friends not to keep wild animals at home." It was more than anyone had expected. Hope, once a silent victim of cruelty and neglect, had become a voice. Not just for herself, but for thousands of wild animals still suffering in illegal captivity. The staff created a permanent enclosure for Hope and her closest companions, one designed to offer maximum stimulation and comfort. Elevated walkways, deeper forest floor, and even a freshwater pool were added. It wasn't the jungle, but it was home. Sometimes I still find myself sitting by the observation deck, watching her nap in the sun, belly up, claws curled lazily. Other times, she's digging a pit near her favorite tree or wrestling with Kinna over a coconut. The bear who once cowered in a cage has become one of our most expressive, engaged, and inspiring residents. But her story doesn't end here. Because the real work, the fight against wildlife trafficking, goes far beyond any single rescue. It's a battle fought in policy rooms, border checkpoints, schools, and homes. Hope's journey may be complete, but the movement she inspired is only just beginning. Hope's recovery was more than a personal triumph, it became a turning point. By the end of 2021, her story had traveled far beyond the forests of Sepalik. Conservation organizations, law enforcement agencies, and educational programs across Malaysia began to cite her as a living example of why the illegal wildlife trade must be stopped, not just because it's illegal, but because it's cruel, inexcusable, and entirely preventable. It's important to understand the context. Wildlife trafficking in Southeast Asia is a deep-rooted problem. In Borneo, sun bears are poached for many reasons. Their bile is used in traditional medicine, their claws and teeth are sold as souvenirs, and the cubs, helpless without their mothers, are often taken as exotic pets. For years, enforcement was weak, public awareness was low, and wild animals were treated as commodities. But hope changed the conversation. When visitors came to BSBCC and saw her, strong, playful, healthy, they asked questions. They wanted to know where she came from, what had happened to her, how she had changed. We answered each one. Her story was painful, but it was real. People listened, and they learned. The center used this momentum to expand its education efforts. We began hosting regular outreach programs in local schools and rural communities, some of which were located near known poaching hotspots. I had the opportunity to accompany some of these trips. We didn't show gruesome photos or lecture people. We showed them hope. We told them about the little bear who was found in a cage, rescued by brave officers, and nursed back to health. We showed them her videos, climbing, foraging, swimming. The message was simple. This is what a sun bear is supposed to look like. Not chained, not confined, not cowering, but free to live as a bear. And it worked. I remember one particular visit to a village school near the Kinabatangan River. After our talk, a young boy approached one of the educators and quietly said that his uncle had a bear cub in a wooden box. He didn't want to get anyone in trouble, he just didn't think it was right. That tip led to the rescue of another cub, one that might have otherwise died alone or been sold into the black market. She was named Lena, and though she had a hard start, she survived. Hope had unknowingly saved another life. Meanwhile, enforcement agencies began partnering more actively with BSBCC. The Sabah Wildlife Department started using Hope's story during training workshops for customs officers and airport personnel. She helped them understand that they weren't just stopping cargo, they were saving living beings. By 2022, Hope had become a kind of celebrity, not in the commercialized sense, but as a living ambassador. She was featured in multiple documentaries, including one that aired across Malaysian national TV. Footage of her exploring her forest enclosure was paired with commentary on the threats faced by sun bears in Borneo. The film included interviews with the rescue team that first found her, BSBCC's founder Wong Su Tay, and several volunteers and keepers who had witnessed her transformation. One of the most powerful moments in the documentary was when Wong said, "Hope shows us what is lost every time we remove a bear from the wild. But she also shows us what can be reclaimed, if we care enough, and if we act in time." That message resonated deeply. The government of Sabah responded by increasing support for wildlife protection. New legislation was passed to tighten regulations around the ownership of wild animals. Penalties for trafficking were made more severe, and permits for animal captivity became more scrutinized. Enforcement alone wasn't enough, but it was an important step. At the same time, BSBCC invested in better facilities and expanded its capacity to care for rescued bears. The goal was clear: to make sure that no sun bear in need was ever turned away. Through all this, Hope remained a quiet constant. She didn't know she had changed anything. She was just living her life, playing, resting, bonding with her companions. But to us, and to thousands who had heard her story, she was a symbol of what's possible when empathy triumphs over greed. I'll never forget one particular day in late 2023. A group of university students had come to the center for a conservation workshop. I was assigned to give a short talk on the bears and lead a tour. When we reached Hope's enclosure, the group went quiet. She was high up on a wooden platform, chewing on a jackfruit. Someone asked if that was the Hope, the one from the news, the schools, the posters. When I said yes, one of the students, probably no older than 20, simply said, "She's the reason I want to study wildlife biology." That's when I realized something profound. Hope wasn't just helping save other bears. She was helping grow the next generation of conservationists. That's how real change happens, not overnight, but slowly, through seeds planted in young minds, inspired by stories of survival, compassion, and action. Today, Hope is around 7 years old. She is fully grown, healthy, and still living at BSBCC, where she continues to thrive in a semi-wild environment with her group. She's not the most dominant, but she's confident. She knows her territory, she knows the routine, and she knows she's safe. There are still difficult days. Bears come in injured, some don't make it. The forests are still threatened. Poaching hasn't stopped entirely. But then I look at Hope, and I remember why we keep going. Because for every bear rescued, every child educated, every trafficker stopped, there is a ripple effect. And Hope is the center of that ripple. A bear who lost everything, and in return, gave back something far greater. Not just survival, not just recovery, but a reason to believe that change is possible.